la diferencia de los cuerpos y la proliferación de sus promesas y potencias. Esta preocupación, como el trabajo de Denise, es parte de una conversación global y necesaria que se vincula decisivamente a la pregunta por la justicia, a la pregunta por la verdad y a la pregunta por las necesidades, tres categorías que están en el corazón del trabajo de Denise. Un esfuerzo en el cual ella participa no solo como académica, sino también como activista, como filósofa, como cineasta. De alguna manera, si tuviéramos que situar disciplinariamente su trabajo, diríamos que es un esfuerzo de revisión crítica de las teorías raciales en sus articulaciones globales, políticas, legales, imperiales, desde una poética negra y feminista. Como scholar es actualmente profesor en the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality and Social Justice en la University of British Columbia en Vancouver, del cual ha sido directora varios años. Sus contribuciones académicas son muy numerosas y no las voy a poder glosar todas. Simplemente citaré dos libros que ya son casi clásicos o sin casi. Towards a Global Idea of Race, publicado en 2007, que desde su comienzo es un testimonio relevante de la forma de tratar el lenguaje y las voces en la escritura, ese universo de voces negras anónimas situadas fuera del tiempo, irreconocibles, que se preguntan por qué, además de ser esclavizadas, marginadas, guetificadas y apresadas, son también asesinadas. La respuesta de Denise es rigurosa y determinada, desvelando las razones filosóficas de esas matanzas, las razones por las que esas matanzas siguen sin producir la indignación que necesitarían. Gracias al trabajo de largo alcance de un paradigma filosófico, epistemológico, político y jurídico, este silencio es posible por medio de la alterización, negación e invisibilización de un sujeto racializado al que el proyecto de una blanquitud nunca lo suficientemente asegurada sigue necesitando matar para poderse afirmar como posibilidad histórica desde la idea de que hay una amenaza que, lejos de desestabilizar ese proyecto de blanquitud y dominio, lo funda. El segundo de sus trabajos que mencionaré se trata de Adivija Impagable, un libro que intersecta desde la larga experiencia posterior a la crisis de las hipotecas del 2008, la importancia del paradigma racial, no solo en la antigua construcción del paradigma colonial, sino en la fundación de las instituciones de los mercados globales, en el mismo corazón del capitalismo avanzado y en la propia idea de deuda y la imposibilidad de su pago como mecanismo que la funda. Deudas que son públicas y al tiempo privadas, financieras y éticas, legales e históricas, en una lectura sabia, fina y terrible que intersecta la conversación sobre la memoria de la esclavitud con las amenazas y violencias propias del neoliberalismo financiero y con la problemática de las reparaciones. La estructura de ese ensayo nos da de nuevo pistas sobre las formas de trabajo tan finas de Denise, pues emplea como disparador de este libro una novela de ciencia ficción, Kindred, que a través de la idea del viaje en el tiempo permite plantear una conversación sobre la genealogía, sobre la memoria y sus lógicas de ocupación del presente, donde la esclavitud flota como fantasma, habitando en la estructura impagable de la deuda cada cuerpo marcado. Denise ha colaborado como autora investigadora con múltiples bienales, museos y otros centros de arte, siempre desde una perspectiva emancipadora y fundante. Un trabajo muy fino del arte en la confrontación y en la apertura en un tipo de estrategia que ella explícitamente denomina estética y especulativa. Sería una suerte de investigación que sueña o un sueño que investiga. Y en este sentido es la autora o la coautora de varias obras de gran carga artísticas, en piezas como Serpent Rain, Four Waters y Corpus Infinitum, en colaboración con Arjuna Newman. Cuando se ha dicho todo es el título de la sesión que hoy nos reúne, a propósito de una práctica artística, estética, sensible, que rompe y con el yo transparente que funda la ontología moderna. Su charla de hoy entonces nos abre esas potencias del arte con las que esperamos aprender a constelarnos. Démosle la bienvenida con un fuerte aplauso.
Buenas noches, yes, buenas noches. Gracias, Germán, for this, I have to say it in English now. I'll try in español, en castellano. Muchas gracias por essa introdução muy comovente, diríamos em português, muy bela em todos os sentidos. E também gostaria de agradecer a Manolo, por la invitación, por hacer posible para mí vir aquí, estar aquí hoy en mi primera visita a Madrid. No es la primera a España, pero primera a Madrid. Y agradecer a ustedes por estarem aquí. Y ahora mi malo castellano se va, and I'll speak in English. Thank you for, living through that. But I told Manolo, next time I'll be speaking in castellano. I'm sharing with you something that it's not a lecture, it's not a talk, usual talk. It's more like an invitation, but it is also a proposal that's been inspired by contemporary artistic interventions that directly comment on the colonial racial cisheteropatriarcal subjugation. It is, as everything I think should be, still work in progress, thinking in progress, and it is a thinking in progress, and the thinking that I'm hoping is not progressing in that linear way, but it's just ongoing. I have to highlight that meaning. But that today I'm going to introduce by the way of the artist Adrian Piper's response to a question, a comment about complaints that one of her work, a work that had won a prize, that it wasn't easily graspable, that its meaning was not accessible, was not transparent. And here's what she says, and I can't control it, right? Yeah. There is not a single central message. This uses language as a means among many, but its meaning cannot be compressed into language or exhausted by language. You have to go in, walk around, listen, read, smell. If you're patient, willing to receive in various channels, and keep thinking about it later, eventually everything will come together. Well, or not, but what's important is what if, right, the invitation. What if instead of approaching the work in search of its intrinsic, unique, or deeper meaning, the public came to it the way Adrian Piper invites or instructs? What if the visitor approached the work of art as something that exists, something to be heard, looked at, read, and smelled? And instead of trying to apprehend, understand, or comprehend it, after taking it in, one just gave in and waited with it, waited for its meaning to arrive or not. What if? So whatever is called, if a name is needed, the approach to art commentary I shared with you this evening does not fit very well into conventional descriptions of aesthetic or art criticism, but also not in descriptions of theoretical critique. If it does not immediately mobilize or really recalls any critical theoretical orientation, and as such it does not fit within other common and relevant uses of the term critical. If the critical, critique, or criticism refers to the task of identifying and exposing the foundations, the rational principle guiding a particular apparatus and deployment of knowledge, and if criticism is the task of evaluating artworks according to a rational principle, Combining the two becomes a simple exercise if one ignores that both are based on the assumption that the term rational, as used in both, means and refers to the same procedure. The same applies to many versions of critical theory and supports its confidence in its own ability to explain, to intervene in social life. And this was a footnote, and it's a footnote that it's important because my proposition is relevant to critique, art criticism, and critical social theory. Now, this proposal departs from these other senses of the task precisely because it challenges what holds them together, which is the type of mental gesture said to be proper to the aesthetic, analytical, and theoretical statements. This mental gesture, evaluation, or judgment both presumes and institutes meaning, as well as a context and something like its production factory and tools for its presentation, apprehension, and comprehension. More precisely, this gesture, which constitutes the context, target, and material for the works that inspired this proposal, this gesture presupposes the figure of the I think, that is, the transparent I, in its various guises as human, humanity, subject, and subjectivity. And it presupposes it as an object of aesthetic, scientific, analytical, or theoretical, and ethical, that is, moral judgment. And also, along with it, it also presupposes the onto-epistemological regime that has prevailed over the last 200 years or so. Because it joins in the task, what I'm presenting to you is also both a commentary on and a method for reading the operations of the colonial racial cisheteropatriarcal matrix of power in the contemporary art scene, but also, of course, beyond. This reading I propose does not, however, focus on issues, events, or statements that would be immediately identified as mechanisms of exclusion or strategies for exclusion, and that would be so on the basis or as evidence for gender, racial, and sexual hierarchies. Actually takes each one of them as each one of the interventions as singular and not merely as exemplary interventions, as, like expressions of a general subjectivity. But instead, it meets the works where they relocate the critical task and the creative practice in the scene of confrontation, as in the movement of refusal of the figure at the center of the scene, or as Fred Moulton teaches us, it encounters them as the object, whether as the other or as a commodity, as the object existing as in resistance. As these works target the figure guiding the very idea of the aesthetic, that of the appreciator, the figure whose original form is the white European cis heteropatriarchal male man, to recall Sylvia Winter. There is always a moment when a sentence just goes and you don't know what happened to it. So let's live with that sentence. It does make sense somewhere. But more importantly, as the opening with Adrian Piper indicates, in this way of thinking with artists and their work, this way of thinking with artists and their work is a kind of a reflection, but one that instead of return to the real or presumed appreciator, the reflection stays with what the artworks offer. That is, it is a response for what the artworks call, or to their call. But what happens in the scene? Well, if you're patient, invites the artist. attentive and receptive, the work will present something that will last far beyond the first meeting. What is the artist asking? What is she inviting us to do? To take a position, or perhaps welcome a disposition, and to stand before the work without presuming, pretending, or promising to know, to understand, or comprehend. Difficult task. How to inhabit this space, walk through the corridors of the exhibition, the museum, without immediately finding yourself in the position of the connoisseur or the appreciator. How to trust in that once this position is exposed, when the reservoir of meanings, its grammar, lexicon, significators are no longer transparent, when its colonial, racial, cisheteropatriarcal constitution becomes evident, how to trust that something else occurs. That's something that unleashes a disorientation that might just resonate, reverberate the artist's intervention, because it halts any immediate grasping of the meaning of the work. It does not allow resolution in as representation. What resonates with the position and orientation Adrian Piper's invitation recalls as state is the refusal of the demand for compliance. That is, these works seem to lack concern with whether the public grasps its meanings, any meaning, or gives it any meaning. And such absence of concern to me suggests several things, including the possibility that the theme of the work is already known, that everything has already been said, or even a rejection of anything that could give the public any indication that they have grasped its meaning, because, the work already belonged to its repertoire. Because it is precisely coloniality and raciality, how they consolidate the position of the aesthetic subject, the position of enunciation, which is available to the artist, the curator, the appreciator, the critical. It is precisely because that position aggregates a categorical and a historical reservoir of racial meanings, that is, terms, formulations, meanings, as well as images and sounds. That is precisely what the works expose, the racial meanings that enter in the composition of the aesthetic text in the 20th century. So this, what is exposed, but also the position that which exposed, I should say, is complex and complicated because in addition to the Kantian subject of the aesthetic judgment, which has the same basis as the scientific subject of experience, the position being confronted also houses the subject of social critique, who may or may not be a Marxist, who may or may not be literate in critical social text, that is to say, in the critical arsenal that targets coloniality, raciality, and cisheteropatriarchy. Much complexity and many complications result from this co-inhabitation. For instance, the subject of criticality can, and I'm pretty sure does, present itself many times as a non-Kantian or even as an anti-Kantian appreciator. However, at the same time, her inclusive decolonial diversity-wise statements about works or artists bear a Kantian orientation, even when not as explicitly as when she rests her claim on his notion of cosmopolitanism. How these interventions, the one I'm thinking with, confront the presumed position and the corresponding orientation in the aesthetic interests me the most, because such orientation, as you know, can manifest in several ways. as unreflective displays of white European or North American economic privilege, as claims to universalism that don't quite get to cosmopolitanism, as a savior disposition, and all the other things that we know about. Regardless of its manifestation, its presentation indicates one of the ways in which raciality operates intrastructurally in the moment of subjectivity, which is, on the one hand, the writing of the transparent I, the transparent subject of reflection, who cannot objectify itself because it engages the world as its own, and the writing of affectable subjects to whom reflection is always already preoccupied by a world that is constituted by representations built according to the tools of racial knowledge and the workings and configuration of the political architecture they helped to build. Precisely this position of the subject and orientation, the subject as the appreciator, that is what I find refused in the works, as they confront precisely that which must remain foreclosed, in the sense given by Spivak in the Critique of Postcolonial Reason, if the critical task is to hold any meaning. So what am I talking about? Well, that's all I had to talk about. So I'm going to use the rest of the time that I don't know how much time I have, sharing with you some of the works I have been thinking with, some of the artists I have been thinking with. And I'm not saying that what I have to say about the works correspond to anything that could be answered by a question that begins with the word what. So all I'm doing is to describe the gesture, refusal, and what it unveils to me. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to share with you how I have been thinking with these artworks by commenting on the works by the British performer and filmmaker Zinzi Minot and the Brazilian performer, filmmaker, sculpturist, and visual artist, and all kinds of things, Paulo Nazaré. What kind of slave would I be? No, what kind of slave would I be? That's how I should ask it. When tracking refusal in these artworks, I was invited to consider a speculative, a creative opening that sometimes explicitly, but mostly only implicitly, stages a direct confrontation with modern representation. So what do I mean by that? When Zinzi Minot asks, what kind of slave would I be? Blackness, in its categorical and historical modes, sustains the speculative exercise despite the presumed irreality of time reversal. In a conversation we had back in 2020, she highlighted that impossibility, she highlighted how that impossibility is available to the artist for speculation, precisely because of how blackness functions as an historical referent. As Saidiya Hartman has noted, the persons to which blackness refer historically, that is the slave, is a mode of existing as human which is not contemplatable as a subjectivity. The I in Minot's question is in the archives, and it is always already occupied because prepositioned by the actuality or the threat of total violence. Historically, the slave, insofar as she is a Negro, a commodity, is an economic entity. As chattel, property, she is a juridic thing. It is as such that she is present in the records, newspapers, title documents, wills. That, of course, extends to her poems and novels, memoirs, and essays as well, because whether she is an enslaved or a freed writer, these do document the political, juridic, economic conditions under which they were written. For this reason, subjectivity, as Hartman notes, is not to be demanded from or imposed on her, while at the same time there is no way of apprehending and properly describing however she manifested or manifests something like interiority. Nor is its unavailability, it is important to add, to be lamented, which is something Minot's speculation gifts us. Would I be a slave, or had I been a slave, as a speculative first-person statement, does not differ from had I not had been one. Both indicate what has not happened. In one case, because the I is positioned ahead in the line of time, and in the second case, because the I is positioned without the condition of enslavement. In both, it is a violation of sequentiality that delimits the task. When we are talking about what kind of a slave would I be, Minot highlighted precisely a connection between these two possibilities when she referred to her wonderings about those she called jumpers, the captured persons who managed to jump off the slave ships and died in the Atlantic Ocean. Those whose remains as particles, as Christina Sharpe recalls, are still part of the planet's waterscapes. What happens when the jumpers are claimed by those of us who descended from those who completed the crossing and were enslaved? What becomes thinkable when Blackness recalls the captive as dead, as ghost, and as molecule, as in one of the atoms that composed the body, or in the elementary particle that composes everything? Whatever else becomes thinkable, and as such takes part at the level of symbolic of this moment, of our now, it will certainly exceed what is made available by the archives of violence, the one which supports the claim to transparency, the one in which silence is the only answer to Minot's question. That is, when the question hails someone who would reply from the position of enunciation the artist occupies as a Black first-person singular. Fortunately, as Minot's artworks offer, the artist is not held by what the archives hold. To the opposite, like Octavia Butler's speculative science fiction, Hartman's and others' critical fabulations and visionary fictions, like they all also testify, the historical and the anthropological archives and their records are also but raw materials available for decompositional intervention. So let me comment on another work, the Feed Them series. The images, sounds, and texts that compose the work give a sense of the kind of reorientation performed, which should be at the core a mental, ethical, and analytical shift in regards to temporality. In all 4 videos in the series, Feed Them 1, Feed Them 1, then Feed Them 2, Feed Them 3 and 4. A figuring of ancestrality as materiality in the reference to the dead captive and the blood that recalls the decomposition. So that figuring of ancestrality as materiality invites the image of reversibility and instead, obviously, of the prevailing sequentiality given by linear time. Okay, I don't want it yet. Ooh. Okay, you go. This is from Feed Them 4, Ancestral Interference. and I'm going to read while you watch it. Here's a description of the work by Zinzi Minot. Ancestral interference is the feeling of rage or anger bigger than our own rage, pain bigger than your own pain. It is the feeling of being tired of a fight you have only just begun. It is the feeling of being on the march forever, of screaming from a place deep inside that does not belong to you. It is the feeling of being frightened for your life, fighting for your life. It is standing on the edge of the sea
That is your mother tongue, that country,
and
that
hearing
you were
screams.
told.
It is being begged by them not to give up. It is being on your portion of a walk that has been ablaze for centuries and feeling the weight of every foot that has walked. It's being strengthened by the ability for your ancestors to lose everything and build something again and again and again.
Caring for you.
When operating as temporal, cultural, historical referent, Blackness cannot yield that which is the condition of possibility for the aesthetic experience, that is, subjectivity, precisely because of how it presents the slave, who is a first-person singular, because of how it presents the slave as a material referent of that particular juridic economic moment. However, when Blackness is deployed to operate as an attribute of a body, not of a type of body, which it does, obviously, categorically, but of a solid organic composite, it recalls the long-dead actual potential, the impossible ancestors, that is, the ones who would never become, who could not have been Minot's jumpers, as well as those who would and did Minot's ghosts. For grounding preposition, in particular, because of how subjectivity can only emerge protected within the arc form of the subject, in Zinzi Minot's artwork, Blackness reclaims what for the transparent eye is immediately given in as memory and history. Recalling, conjuring, claiming without reliance on kinship, bloodline, or cultural heritage, DNA, or organic biological inheritance. In Minot's work, Blackness reclaims ancestry to refer to, and as it inheres the body itself, her body, the ancestrality of its raw material, and also, as always already, of the decomposition. No, it's not mine. Could have been, just like mine. Always already, where was I? Okay. The ancestrality of its raw materials, and also, as always already, a redecomposition of other raw materials that is of existence, that both constitute and sustain it. The body that would have been that of a slave does this work as a still or moving image that distorts the historical record. That is, however, here. The however that threatens and usually occupies, hijacks my thinking as I sit with the work and try and wait for it. These are its conditions of possibility, the colonial, racial, cisheteropatriarcal matrix, which is confronted in, by, through, with, and also as the work. Always under the risk of being resolved back into something properly artistic, expectedly black or white or Asian, deeply cultural, safely different, undeniably cishetero or queer female or black gender non-conforming trans-Asian, the body has consistently figured as a means or a target of state capital and its extractive and expropriative mechanisms. That's always there standing in front of us. But as I think with Zinzi Minot's work, I sense echoes of many other artists, including some that I'm just going to show that images here, like Jota Mombasa, a Musa Michele Mattiusi, and the brilliant Castiel Vitorino Brasileiro. But also, her work makes me think of the work of Paulo Nazaré, who is the second artist I'm going to talk about. When Paulo Nazaré made this statement in a 2014 interview to Keep On magazine, he was addressing directly what was then, was the before, and remains unquestionably one of the most urgent global issues of our times: this displacement of populations of Black and brown people from their homes in the former colonies of Europe, in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, in the island countries of the Pacific and the Caribbean, and in the Middle East. The juridico-economic and not simply ethical humanitarian significance of this global issue is what he highlights, and I will quote: "If these countries, the USA and Europe, do not want to let illegal immigrants and refugees, please do not promote political instability and oppressive economic policies in the peripheral countries," end quote. Many of Nazaré's artworks comment on this, while at the same time recalling its historical precedents and global reverberations. Okay, I have to remember to move now. His work, the theme of the relationship between art and the political is always very explicit, and it appears in reference that the work, it appears primarily in reference to the work that raciality does in ensuring the success of the very articulation of the many different discourses on global crises we have lived through in the past couple of decades, if not longer. But here I'm interested in how it appears in the work's direct confrontation with a sensibility held by cultural difference, which is that of the transparent eye, or the one today's appreciators display, which is the one that cannot accommodate anti-colonial and anti-racist expressions as properly aesthetical and properly political, and which, for this reason, consistently and recursively reads them as ethnographic specimens. Nazaré's mode of presentation, his compositional strategy, comment on these current political circumstances by confronting and undermining attempts at reading both his work and his intention as just another operation of cultural difference. Through repetition, humor, and a healthy dosage of weirdness and urgency, Paulo Nazaré's performances, photographs, sculptures, and installations allow me to consider a sensibility that presumes and anticipates what lies beyond all that has been said and done about colonial and racial violence and the work they perform for global capital. Each one of his artwork is a composition of elements, of registers of total and symbolic violence against Black and indigenous populations, as well as of their strategies of refusal and survivance. Through pieces collected in international and transcontinental walks, or created sculptures, videos, or drawings, Nazaré's performances and installations collapse the distinction between the ephemeral, casual, and the monumental, formal, in a way that renders the use of explicit elements of critical racial, anti-colonial, or anti-capitalist discourse unnecessary and even, I will say, unhelpful. And it does so, I find, because in his work, both his body in the films and performances and objects collected and created, in his performance, these do not stand for anything other than themselves. That is, neither of the usual descriptors for the artwork's mode of signifying, metaphor and metonymy, captures how his materials and media, his body and objects, prefigure colonial and racial subjugation and possible tools, methods, and strategies for their demise. literality, I find, is a more suitable descriptor for a mode of figuring that is self-referential. That is one that does not recall something else in form as metaphor or content, metonymy. For instance, in this piece for the Latin American Pavilion at the 56th Venice Biennale, at the Indigenous Voices, which was curated by Alphonse Hug. This is a good example. With the focus on the region's endangered indigenous languages, the exhibition displayed the work of artists from 16 countries, including Nazaré's sound installation, in which he and Guarani Kaiowá children repeat words in Portuguese and Kaiowá. The sound piece, which I'm not playing, in which one hears his and other voices repeating those words, it's given without any commentary or indication of how it relates to the larger theme of the pavilion. Mere presentation, juxtaposition without any marker of hierarchy or dominance between the two languages. The indigenous children and Nazaré speaking both languages. On the other hand, there is the description, which you see here, some of it, that retells recent, past, ongoing colonial violence against indigenous persons and populations, and that too without analytical and interpretive mediation. It registered the ongoing attempt at the total obliteration of indigenous peoples throughout the continent. Of course, there is no reason to think that the audience did not connect the dots. However, I'm not sure if it did more than to read it in a culturally or historically determined mode of expression as Latin American, Brazilian, indigenous, black, etc. That the very mode of presentation of the Venice Biennale with its national pavilions invites such reading is, and it's not beside the point here. To be sure, what I find in this work, and also others by Nazaré, is precisely a response to such likely, because overdetermined by the form of the Biennale, right, this likely reading. Juxtaposing two languages, an image of the children posing like members of the Bro MC, which was a popular indigenous rap group back then, and recounting the ongoing total violence against indigenous populations and persons in the Americas without operators to signal a critical stance, the parts of Nazaré's sound piece stand for what they are, each presenting an aspect of indigenous existence, of survivance in the face of ongoing colonial violence. Language, Kaiowá and Portuguese, musical forms, hip-hop, and state-perpetrated or authorized violence. And then I have the piece, which is the video. Oh, I forgot this one. So how do I play the video now? I never know how to. Here it is. So this piece, the tree of forgetting, in it, I find a refusal to deploy the available signifiers of the ruling racial discourse in the presentation of colonial and racial violence. So this tree is a monument to enslavement. It is in Benin, in the west coast of the African continent. And the history is, it's not a story, it's a historical documents, is that before the enslaved persons were put in the slave ships to be brought to be sent to the Americas, they were forced to walk around the tree over 100 times in order to forget where they came from and who they were. And Nazaré is doing the same thing, walking backward. How it is rendered, how the work tries and resists the comprehension of the artist's intention as an expression of his or her cultural difference. Nazaré to present anti-colonial and anti-racist statements that escape the grips of representation, and he does so precisely because of the refusal to any kind of modality of figuration that would appeal to and please the audience's critical literacy. His compositions index simultaneous operation of colonial and racial violence as well as of survivance in all of these scales. What the works make evident, and here I'm moving towards a conclusion as we watch Paulo Nazaré doing his thing. What these works make evident, however, to me, is how the Kantian program is constitutive of the artistic context of creation, curatorship, appreciation, and critical commentary. For this reason, while the approach proposed here and the critical descriptor is still aimed at the transparent eye, actually, I don't want to read this version. That's why I have the computer. Sorry. Well, yes. The reason I have the computer is because I remember to add something, because it happened just recently. So the version that I want to present of what I was just reading is what is like a statement on what the staging of the scene of the confrontation, on what the works make evident. And it is, as I'm saying, how the Kantian program is constitutive and remains operative in the artistic context of creation, curatorship, appreciation, and critical commentary. So I was presenting the same paper in Palma de Mallorca the other day, the day before yesterday. And after I presented as part of a panel, we had 4 presentations, and then we had a panel discussion. And all the 4 presentations, we all kind of commented on the same thing, which is very similar to what I'm talking about here. But then during the panel discussion, which was a lot about how to dislodge the transparent eye from the museum and other art or cultural institutions, someone got up and said that it was time to bring some friction to the conversation. And among other things, I don't remember, the person said, well, visuality is knowledge. And that's it. But anyway, while the approach proposed here and the critical descriptor, the figure of the appreciator, is still aimed at the transparent eye as it figures in the notions of the aesthetic, such as subjectivity, in the analytical judgment as an object of critical theory, the focus is on the moment of the infrastructure that sustains it, that is a position, orientation, intention, and interpretation. In particular, I'm interested in how specific work, installation, exhibition, film performance put us in confrontation, that is, it prepositions us in anticipation in relation to one of those or more of these moments. And in doing so, however, what's anticipated, what can be seen in the work in presentation or articulated by the artist as her intention, are the operations of coloniality and or raciality, presented under the guise of public, whether as the conventional or critical position of the critical connoisseur, or terms of orientation, intention, etc. And this presentation of the public can manifest in various ways, as I mentioned before. But I just would like to end with just this brief commentary that when it does so, when the way the artistic work now, when the work of confrontation is done through with the artwork, what one can sense is also how it refracts and fractures transparency. And it does so precisely because its materials refigure the intensity of colonial, racial, and cisheteropatriarcal violations expressed in the highest but still noticeable bands, frequencies. And that allows for the possibility of considering sensibility beyond the visible, beyond what's presumed and reiterated by notions such as taste and the beautiful, and also the other one, the sublime. Thank you for your attention. No, I think I can. If I don't understand, I just ask.
Gracias, Denise. Ahora tenemos un tiempo para preguntas, comentarios, ideas, así que bienvenidas a levantar la mano y tomar la palabra. Para romper el hielo simplemente, quería preguntarte, Denise, hay, creo, ¿no?, como algo muy interesante en cómo estás trabajando la idea de tiempo, la idea de temporalidad, ¿no?, en todas estas piezas y en el propio corazón del proyecto, y también obviamente vinculado con la memoria. Y me gustaría escuchar un poco algo más también explícito quizás sobre ese sentido de la temporalidad en la que has estado trabajando toda la charla.
Thank you for that question. It could just keep me talking for another hour, you know that, because it is truly working with temporality, but I think what I'm trying to do it has several movements. There are several things that are at work there, but there are two movements. One is the usual critical gesture of identifying, describing, and exposing the works that linear temporality does. It does at the level of discourse. It does as we speak, because it forces us to speak and write in a certain way. But it also works in the very terms and components of the word, of the text, but also of the artwork. So on the one hand, that is that work that I think we have had critiques of linear temporality around for 60 years, maybe. The post-structuralists have been writing for that long, not talking about the structuralists, the ones before. But in critical social discourse, like the ones that target the colonial racial cisheteropatriarcal matrix, the prevailing account is still the linear one, right? The one that will, eventually lead, like the Rancière way, lead to equality at some moment in the future, because the very demand for inclusion assumes that inclusion is something that is to happen in time, and then if it hasn't happened, then it should happen in the future. So I'm saying that to say, like, okay, critique of temporality, the critiques have been going on for a while, but that is an area of critical investigation and engagement where we need it, and it's very difficult because it's so much about history. So it's very difficult to unleash a critique of temporality in that sense. And for that reason, because colonial racial subjugation are so much, in a way, they're both operators, but also, how do I say that? They're operators, but they also embody time, right? This, which can be seen as a linear unfolding, can be seen as a linear unfolding which is colonial history and its aftermath, which also doesn't mean that the colonial is gone, it's just some things have changed. So it's difficult to let go of time, and I think that's why, you know, you have Paulo Nazaré going back to the tree, and then you have also Zinzi Minot with her electronic interference in the ocean itself. So I think that's why history becomes this crucial raw material for the works, and it becomes of interest, becomes a preoccupation for those who are engaged in confronting racial colonial subjugation. But the only way to get rid of the preoccupation is to, in a way, do the work of temporality to death, or to the death of temporality. And this is what I've been trying to do by attending to something that is basic, right? Because time, the sense of time passing we have is all about heat, basically. You know, the reason why you think that time moves in one direction is because of entropy. Things, you know, tend to disorganization. So if you break something, there is no way of unbreaking it. But that conceptually is all about heat. It's all about transfer of internal kinetic energy. And I've been thinking about what happens along those lines with everything else that is connected with this idea of transfer, which is what I call materiality, or that which is characteristic of matter at the quantum level, which is, but also not only at the quantum, but also the atomic level, which is this becoming something else. So, for instance, now I'm speaking to the microphone, and my voice is being transformed. They call it transformed. They call it transduced. The sound waves are transduced into electrical waves, and then, you know, the speakers are transducing those electrical waves into sound waves. So it happens all the time. My computer is, you know, here radiating some very dangerous things all the time with me. But then at the same time, the fact that happens means that somehow, as it happens and happens all the time, in the general sense of the time it happens. It is existence, you know. It is that which characterizes existence. So it makes it possible to talk about what has happened in a way that does not obey the impositions of linearity, because linearity forces you to leave things behind, because you go from one point to another, and you assume that what's happened may have brought about what's happening now, but it's no longer here, right? Only its effects. Like, we keep thinking with this efficient causality thing. But if we just take materiality for what it is, so anything and everything that happened, on the one hand, keeps happening, and then it keeps happening in some other existence that are now composed of the same elementary particles that thing was. So that's the other part of the work. And then, of course, doing that allows for all kinds of different claims. That's why it would take a long time to answer the question, because I haven't got to what it allows one to do, but I'll just venture and say that, for instance, demands for reparations and restitutions, which are usually disavowed because, wow, it happened such a long time ago. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was a slave owner. I have nothing to do with that. Well, if we just assume that slave labor has been the basis for the production of what yielded profit that was reinvested in more capital that became, you know, like available to build institutions like this one, then you can say that the energy spent, the body of the enslaved, that was spent in the extraction of gold in Mexico or in Brazil is built into the walls of this institution. It's right here. Hasn't gone anywhere. So that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I have to say I'm a little overwhelmed just by all the theory, and then it's such rich philosophy that I was unfamiliar with, so it gives me a lot to go back and read after. But it was kind of interesting because when you started talking about the transparent I had understood EYE, not I. So I was interested in that, like if you could maybe help to elaborate that idea, because I was unfamiliar with the Hegelian. Like I was just trying to understand a little bit more, but that notion was really fundamental to your presentation. I think I might have missed the beginning of that. And then the question you proposed that you mentioned that was made in Mallorca concerning visuality as knowledge, and I think I understood what the question was going at, but it seems like it's it contradicts the very notion of the beginning of your presentation, if I understood that correctly, with the work of art needing more time to understand and to comprehend, and perhaps no final comprehension will come. So this is like the question of Mallorca seemed to want some urgencies, to want some immediacy of the work of art that I think goes against what the presentation had begun with. So those are some ideas that are more rambling than anything. Thank you.
Thank you. It's funny because your ideas are both very well connected, right? Transparent I, EYE, and visuality is knowledge. So yeah, I think you said, you answered your own question, but I'm going to answer it again for you. So yes, the comment, I'll start from the end. Yes, the comment at after during the panel discussion contradicted what I had said, precisely because what I had said was and is, and still is, sat exactly in confrontation with a conception of, I would say it is in the field of the aesthetic, but it's not only. It is in our whole existence. The idea that the human stands in the world with everything, but it is unlike anything else that exists, right? That we are there. And for that reason, not only everything is available to us for extraction, expropriation, instrumentalization, and use of different forms, but also, however we are, whatever happens to us is not caused by that which exists alongside us. And this view of the human humanity that, I think it consolidates in the late 19th century, but for sure the 20th century, if we trace it in the history through the major books of modern philosophy, we find it, there, it's elements there everywhere. And the philosopher that I'm going after here, because, kind of defines the field, Immanuel Kant, he's the one that best articulated it. And in his anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, he did lots of things, description of cognition, but also it includes an analysis of the senses in which he talks about each one of them. And then, of course, the first one he talks about is the sense of smell, which is not a high sense among the higher ones, but it's still not so bad because it still presumes a distance between the person and what she's smelling. Sight, vision, is the highest of them because it is the most abstract, and because it allows you to apprehend what's before you without any risk of being, affected by it. And then touch is the lowest, the crudest, the coarsest, he says, because, So that, right? So the transparent I with the I, the letter I, is a name I gave to the figuring of the modern subject that emerges at the beginning of the 19th century in Hegelian philosophy, in which Hegel's account of reason, of universal reason as spirit, this transcendental subject, basically describes a moment in which the human mind, the rational human mind, European, as we know, male, etc., human mind finally recognized that there is no fundamental difference between himself and the world, that he and the world are basically, different manifestations of the same transcendental entity, which is reason. So the world becomes transparent to him, Let's talk. We go from the Kantian abstraction, which, demanded a separation between the human, the rational human, and all that exists, to the Hegelian, sublation that transforms everything into just other lower manifestations of the post-Enlightenment European human. So when the person in the audience said, you know what, visuality is knowledge, as I started talking about asking what if we just sat with the work, smelled it, touched it. Yeah, so the friction was there. I don't know why he said he was going to bring the friction. All there was friction, but he made it. He made my point too, which was, helpful, I think. But yeah, so the transparent I, but the thing is that I, right, the I actually plays a crucial role in the very constitution of all of the figurines of the transparent I, but in particular of subjectivity, because in addition to nature, which is science's apprehension of what exists, we saw at the beginning of the 20th century phenomenology, which is still with us, just basically, assembling this notion of world, which presupposes transparency, which assumes the same kind of separation, which describes the movement as a movement of apprehension. Okay, so it is abstract, but it still is one of apprehension, and positions the meaning of everything already in the mind. I mean, following the same thing, but it is what to me explains why we can bring about, the transformation of the planet to an extent that we won't be able to live in it and don't realize what's happening, right? It is a very powerful force, the one that does it. That has humans really, living and going about existence as if we are from some other planet, not of this one, as if there is escape route somehow, somewhere. And that's why, it matters to go after transparency in that way. That is on.
Hello. Oi. I'm very shy, so maybe it's going to be difficult to understand, but I try to speak slow. And I also don't know anymore if the question or intervention makes sense. But before was connected to German question of time, and I kind of then linked to the I and the self, maybe in relation to being in and out of the space, and then maybe so the question goes towards space. But before the intervention of the I was thinking in na Leda Maria Martins e na noção de tempo espiralar, and maybe how that can relate to your understanding and proposition of time. But then I was it also remind me this is something that I've been trying to connect, and it's been difficult for me com a noção do Milton Santos de espaço. For Milton Santos, at least what I can understand, space is acumulação desigual de tempos, so it's an unequal accumulation of time. And I think it makes a lot of sense in relation of what you said, that the slave is here in the material of the body of this space. I also think is also in material, for example, in the light, and we go to like this imperialism and coloniality happening. So yeah, my question is, can you talk about space or Milton Santos a little bit, or just?
Yeah, Leda Maria Martins' notion of spiral time, tempo espiralar, spiral time, spiral. I am not extremely familiar, but I know I have read some things, and I understand that it's a notion of time that it is a time that returns, right? But not the time itself, but as some things that. Can you say more about it? No, maybe no. Don't do it. And the Milton Santos notion of space as accumulation of time, of what's happened, I think it is, makes me think of Lefebvre production of space, because it's a Marxist geography that, actually, in a way, reconcile, bring space into the history of capital and allows us to to develop analysis of capital and its trajectories by, attending to the how of things at a given moment in time and space, a given place. I don't know. It may be, especially in the case of Leda's conception of time, it may be that there is a moment where what I'm thinking, how I'm thinking about it, connects to how she's conceiving of tempo espiralar. I don't think with Milton Santos that much, just because it's a historical materialist approach, and I'm kind of unleashing a critique to that approach as a critique from inside home. So sometimes it's very similar, but there are some differences. But let me just say that what I'm really after is, and I'm not really after, no, let's say, that at one level, which is the more abstract, philosophical one, I'm interested and invested in the dissolution of linearity. And linearity as it is present, like lots of quotes, in the notion of time and in the notion of space. So the linearity in the notion of time that gives that sense of passing in the very abstract, and then that prevents us from realizing, connecting things that are obviously, fundamentally connected. And on the other hand, also the linearity of space, which is that it creates the separation that allows us to conceive of separation even without, even when we are trying not to articulate that. And again, linearity, and in doing so also prevent some statements that I believe would collapse some of the major statements in, not only statements in modern thinking, but also some of the bases of the institutions in which we live. So I'm interested in space-time at that level. But because I don't know, right, I mean, sometimes, even as it seems that we are working with the conception in the usual ways, there are some connections that are made or some attempts that actually takes it out. So, and I'm saying that because tempo spiralar could be thought as like mythical time versus historical time, which is a distinction anthropology made like since the beginning of the 20th century. But I'm hoping that Leda Maria Martins' tempo spiralar is not only mythical time, not another dichotomy, that actually it opens up to something that it shouldn't be called time anyway, which is what I'm more interested in. So that's why I keep, I try to use what happens, what exists, where it happens, how it exists, and avoiding, even when talking about what's happened, avoiding making a statement that would connect what's happened to what's happening in the way that linearity forces us to connect. But you could check it out, see what conception of, if you find some sense of linearity in, even if it is this line, right? I mean, it's still something that's the same. The idea, is that which, whether the line goes this way, or this way, may still be the same. And if it is the same, then that is, if all that changes is the line in the spiral, so I'm suspicious of that. So I was trying to think, is it Heraclitus that says the thing about the river, that you don't step in the same river twice, or there is, right? Yeah. I was thinking like, why is it even a consideration? Of course it is and it is not the same river, right? Both, it is and it is not. That's it. The water, always it is and it is not. But we raise the question that forces us to separate, define, limit. So that is what, and linearity is, thanks to Plato's solids and other things, we just have it in our head.
Muchas gracias por la organización de este encuentro. Muchísimas gracias, Denise, por compartir. Y me interesa muchísimo este tema, dado que también estoy trabajando con artistas indígenas contemporáneos y encuentro muchos puntos en común, bastantes diría yo. Y me interesó bastante la idea de la estética y me pregunto también si esa idea de la estética está atravesada desde lo que le he escuchado a partir de los artistas con los que usted ha compartido, tiene que ver con esa idea de la estética atravesada por la colonialidad, por la racialidad y por el sometimiento. Y me preguntaba si podríamos pensar una idea de la estética no desde el pensamiento occidental, sino desde el pensamiento desde el que usted parte. Gracias.
Desde el pensamiento de la última cosa que dije.
Afro, negro, podríamos pensar así una idea de... por provocar, ¿eh? Gracias.
Gracias por la cuestión. I think Zinzi Minot does that. And I think Paulo also, and most of those artists I have been thinking with, that's very much what they do also, but they do so in a way that in a way that avoids that then it's no longer, it's not art, it's not aesthetic, right? It's only culture, it's only belief, it's something else that is out. And for them, it's always also, it's not only, but it's also, but not only. And it is in that tension that I find that the work is generative for thinking, because there is no refusal, like there is no refusal of ancestrality, for instance. So in Zinzi Minot, it's more along the lines of family, memory, but Ana Beatriz Nogueira, her last name, she's a black Brazilian artist, and she does work on ancestrality, but it's all connected to African religions, through African Brazilian religions. And in a way, they do, it's very similar, what they do with time. And the difference that Zinzi is more directly confronting the history, especially UK's history, while Ana Beatriz does the confrontation from within the articulation of ancestrality, totally grounded, totally informed by African philosophy and religion, not Afro-Brazilian, because even though she's Brazilian, she actually she has a family back in Benin, I think, and then she does it. So I see, I think that is something that's complex because the works are also refusing. They are refusing to be seen as. So Paulo, for instance, he refuses to be an indigenous artist, and he refuses to be a black artist. And we gotta live with him because he's also not a mestizo. He makes both claims, and he's both, and he does both, and that's it. You live with that. Like the curators, anyone who writes about his work has to live with that and find a way of doing that. So there are other groups in Brazil, especially collectives, that is Carne, the Black and Indigenous Art Collective, and they are Black and Indigenous artists in Recife, in Pernambuco. And they also, refuse to be. Because of the particular history of Northeast Brazil, Paulo is not from there, but it's very similar. They refuse. Some of them will present themselves as indigenous artists or black artists, but in the work itself, they actually do not. They don't want to name what it is. So there is something else. There is something happening there, which I think it is a response. It is a Black, indigenous, American, in the larger sense, in the name of the continent, response to the ongoing racial colonial violence that needs to do both, right? And I find the same thing in writers like Davi Copenau and Krenak. They are also confronting colonial racial violence philosophically in the case, right? Not as as artists. So there is something happening which, I don't know in the U.S. how it is actually. I know that the sense of humor of the folks in Latin America is, you can't miss it, and I love it, because it's also so silly and funny. But yeah, I think so. I don't know, I think I'm not going to, write about it. I'm more interested in the moves, in how they do it, but I think there is something there. But that would require other bases for what I find in them, like this other sensibility, this other, it doesn't need to be named, it just has to be other than the one that prevails here. It doesn't even need a name, something else.
While you were talking about Minot's work, you were also talking about the jumpers and blackness as ghosts or something phantasmagorical. And in what terms do you relate this with archives, and in what ways do you like to approach archives in your work? Could you explain it? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I have done work on the archive. I have been to the archive. I have spent like 8 years of my life doing that work. Now, what I was highlighting the fact that these artists, they return, like Zinzi and others, they return to the archives of violence, where you would usually find the figure of, you would usually find suffering, or besides documentation of total violence, documentation of all different forms of violence. And in that documentation, in those records, you would never find anything that could figure as a proper figure in the field of aesthetics or even of politics, because the proper political static figure is not the one that suffers, right? It is the one that's the transparent eye that I was talking about. And what I find in many of these works, like Rosana Paulino, for instance, who is also a Black Brazilian artist, is that they go back to these archives, and they take them as raw materials, right? And they do something else. So it's not only about, so Rosana, she has all different kinds of work, but there is a thing that she does, she calls suturing, and then she takes pictures of photos that are in books of, enslaved persons, anthropological images, plates, and then she takes care of them that way, right? But in a way that you can see it. So while you have this image of naked persons, Black persons, naked enslaved persons, and which are clean, clear images, photographs from books, she goes there and then she sews and doing the work that she calls. She says it's suturing because it is really, because the pieces cannot be brought together, but the artist is doing the work that needs to be done. But then they can't be brought together because of the nature of the violence, and that not being able to bring them together exposes that violence in the pieces that are in the archive. So they're literal. But then yet there is something that you look and you look again, right? There is that something else that happens in there. So yes, I'm more interested in following and thinking with what they do, and what in doing so they make possible for me and others to think and say. Things that if I were just to read history books, I would not be able to say, because they would just tell me, yeah, the archive is all violence. Oh, no, look closely, you'll find something, right? So, but the artists do something else, they mess it up. It's like, the archive becomes something else, very explicitly with them.
Hi, it's working? Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. And I was wondering, because you're an artist too, I was curious about how you, I don't know if you could elaborate a bit on how you, work on this idea of dismantling this colonial and heteropatriarcal and gaze we have inherited from Enlightenment, and how you incorporate that idea in your practice that I'm not very familiar with, but I know you work on video and you work on relational practices, so I know you're interested in astrology too, so I was wondering what are the strategies or the ways you find to investigate on these ideas of aesthetic that are other than the one we are used to? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so the first film with Arjuna, Serpent Rain, was a funny one because Stefano Harney put this together and said, we should do a film about the Frederiksborg, which was a Norwegian ship which was found off the coast of Denmark back in the 70s. And that proved that Norway was involved in slave traffic. And we were supposed to do something about that. And we went to Bergen, and we filmed in the shipyard. It was raining, it was horrible. Many, many days, it was cold. And at the end of the day, it's like, no, it's not working. Because I was talking about time. And slavery and all kinds of things. And it wasn't working because I was just, I could just write it. I had written it. So I can't remember exactly how it happened, but then, I also have these works with the elements, classic elements, air, fire, earth, water, which are also about transition, transformation. So we just thought that maybe, there was a problem with time, with linear time, and there was a problem with the linearity of the film. So the two of them were undermining everything that I was saying. It really was horrible. Felt so violent trying to do the impossible. So we thought, so that's what happened. So time was a problem, so let's use the elements. And this was the beginning of this collaboration in which that's what we do. We experiment. The films are experiments with the elements in the presentation, in the visual presentation of the materials. We also play with sound a lot in there. And so Serpent Rain, as we finished, it's like, is a failed film without time, because we decided, let's do a film without time. And that's what we did. And, it is obviously 30 minutes long, but the effort of holding back linearity, opened up for the other films we're doing. Now we are working on the one on air, which is about, actually we talk about ghosts in this one. But the thing with the film, with the elements, is precisely that they allow us to talk about, in the different films, For Waters, which is the water one, and Soot Breath, which is the earth one. They allow us to talk about extraction and expropriation and violence and global capital and all of those things, and at the same time make commentary on modern thinking without being this, right, talking head here. And they do in different ways sometimes. Soot Breath is amazing because both of us, we cry when we watch the film. It's like, how come we came up? It was the film that we most, like, we had everything planned. We knew exactly what we were going to do. It was all like, blah, blah, blah. And then when it all came together, I think because of how all the elements in it work, it does something which we were not expecting that it would do. So that's the how, because it's still very much some intellectual exercise it's an intellectual expression of a critique of modern thinking in which both of us are interested. But I think so. I'm not really good to talk about how we do it, but I think that the effort as we attempt in the materials we use and the forms, the film with Arjuna, and then the relational practice with Valentina, which is the reading. The doing of the thing does what the thing does. I don't know. That's what I can see, right? I can sense it because, I'm doing the work, but I don't know. There is no formula. There is no way of saying how. Which is that I think also that's why I think I like to think with others' work too, because there is always that gap between what you want to do and what the choices you make and how it all comes together, and what happens when somebody stands before the work. And that singularity, like all those singular moments coming together, and I think that's very powerful. You can write 1,000 pages and not get to what may happen just like, in a second. So.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Muito obrigado, Denise.
Obrigada, gente. Thank you.